Of course, war is horrible, so why did the Palestinians initiate this war with their vicious attack on Israelis on October 7th?
Well, they didn't. They didn't. This war has been going on for 75 years. Israel initiated it in 1948 by ethnically cleansing 750,000 people. We must expel Arabs. We must expel Arabs and take their places.
The U.S.
We must expel Arabs and take their places. And if we have to use force, not to dispossess the Arabs of the Negev and Transjordan, but to guarantee our own right to settle in those places, then we have force at our disposal. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, said that in 1937. And that's what they proceeded to do. The people in Gaza, this is what you need to understand. The people in Gaza, over 80% of them are refugees. Many of them are from a place called Majdal Asqalon in what is now southern Israel, in a city called Ashkelon. And they were dragged from their homes and driven from their homes, placed in prison camps, barbed wire prison camps, and then dumped in trucks in 1950 into the Gaza Strip, where they would be permanently warehoused. And then Israel proceeded to move Arab, Jewish refugees and Russians into Ashkelon to prevent them from ever coming back, and pass laws to prevent Arabs, Palestinians from being able to return to their homes. 750,000 were ethnically cleansed. For 18 years, the remaining Palestinians, 100,000, were internally displaced inside Israel. The remaining were put under military rule. They were under military occupation until 1966. Then in 1967, Israel violently, in a war it initiated, occupies Gaza, occupies the West Bank, occupies the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights in East Jerusalem, and then invades Lebanon in 1982, attacking Palestinian refugees there, puts Gaza under siege in 2005. No one can get in or out without Israeli military permission. We must kill and kill all day, every day. That's according to Arnon Sofer, an Israeli government consultant who helped devise the siege of Gaza. For years, Israel would not allow certain chocolates and A2 paper into Gaza. And then they began these brutal military assaults, which they call mowing the lawn. Slaughtering a few people will leave Hamas intact, but teach them a lesson. And I talked to you about those assaults that took place on Gaza. So this didn't come out of a vacuum. You're not going to be able to hold people under siege, then cut them off from the world, and then expect them to just play along. And that doesn't mean that I celebrate what happened on October 7th. It should have never had to happen. The reason it happened is because of the Israel lobby here, the genocide Democrats and the genocide Republicans who deny the Palestinians any right to have rights. And it's the right to have rights that defines you as a citizen. They're citizens of nothing. And now we see what Israel really thinks of them, really thinks of their children. Gaza has become a graveyard for children, according to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. So this didn't start on October 7th, and it's not going to end when there's a ceasefire.
Western media will never tell you why Palestinian fighters took hostages, because it challenges their narrative. They were taken for a hostage swap. At that time, Israel held 5,000 Palestinian prisoners, including children, over 1,000 held without charge or trial. The ones who are charged go through military courts. In these courts, the judges and prosecutors are all Israeli occupation soldiers in uniform, and there is a 99% prosecution rate. Since 1967, more than 800,000 Palestinians have been detained, amounting to 40% of the male population. Israeli occupation forces inflict systematic physical, psychological, and sexual torture on detainees, beginning with violent arrests and escalating during interrogation. The Palestinian Prisoners Society reports 95% of Palestinian detainees have suffered torture. Children are not spared. Of the 500 to 700 Palestinian children that are kidnapped every year, Save the Children reports that 86% of them are beaten, 69% are strip searched, and nearly half are injured at point of arrest, including gunshot wounds and broken bones. Some children also reported being transferred in small metal cages, probably where Israel got their idea for their now disproven propaganda. And things have gotten much worse. Just over the past few weeks, the number of Palestinian prisoners has almost doubled. Reports of abuse have increased, and 2 Palestinian hostages have died in prison.
Because we are seeing children, innocent children, blown to bits. Children who are getting the limbs amputated without pain, without anaesthetic, because of the blockade. And I was in Palestine in 2015 with Operation Protective Edge, and I witnessed with my own eyes aid being prevented from getting into Gaza when Israel decided to, as they say, mow the lawn. And that's what they do. Every few years they go in and they bulldoze.
Do you think we has been
pulverised,
slow to recognise the terror that has been inflicted by Hamas?
Everybody has condemned October 7th. Everybody has condemned. That does not justify going in and slaughtering innocent women and children. Absolutely nothing justifies it. And it's rich for Amos to talk about law and what's legal in a war. They don't respect the International Court of Justice. They have tried to undermine the UN and UNRWA. So they think that they can act whatever way they like because Israel has been allowed to act whatever way it likes. And that has to change. There has to be sanctions. There has to be consequences for any state that goes rogue. And at the moment, under Netanyahu's government, Israel has become a rogue state.
Has deliberately starved the people of Gaza. Starved. I'm not using an exaggeration. I'm talking literally starving a population. Israel is a criminal, is in nonstop war crime status now. I believe in genocidal status. And it is without shame, without remorse, without truth, without insight into what it's doing. But what it is doing is endangering Israel's fundamental security because it is driving the world to believe that the Israeli state is not legitimate. This will stop when the United States stops providing the munitions to Israel. It will not stop by any self-control in Israel. There is none in this government. This is a murderous gang in government right now. These are zealots. They have some messianic vision of controlling all of today's Palestinian lands. They're not going to stop. They believe in ethnic cleansing or worse, depending on whatever is needed. And it is, again, the United States, which is the sole support, and it's our mumbling, bumbling president and the others that are not stopping this.
This is a shocking story at the New York Times. I hope you pay attention to every word of it. You cannot make this up. A New York Times reporter has just been outed and is now being investigated by the New York Times, and sources say she's been fired for 2 reasons. One, for making up fake news and fabricating the now famous mass rape hoax story that the New York Times ran as a cover story, which has now been fully debunked. And 2, the second reason she's been fired, just so happens to be a former Israeli intelligence officer who worked in the Israeli Air Force.
Oh, you missed that one, did you?
I mean, this is who the New York Times hires to be their reporters. It gets worse, by the way. It gets worse. I'm just starting. This is really a shocking story about really how the deep state plants people inside of newsrooms to get propaganda pushed out to the masses, and how the New York Times, of course, is one of the most corrupt news organizations in the world. As Americans, we should be asking, how does Israeli intelligence, though, a whole other country, manage to plant a fake reporter in an American news outlet? like the New York Times, and then let her publish a front page story. It gets worse. So let's actually go through some of these details here. The article in question that set off a firestorm was titled thusly, "Screams Without Words: How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7th. Now, we're not saying that sexual violence didn't happen on October 7th. That's not what this story is about today. What we're specifically focusing on is this fake story, okay? That's what we're focusing on. And then how it was parroted around the mainstream media like CNN, BBC, Fox News, all over the place. So just so we're clear what we're talking about here. So this was published just after Christmas on December 28th, that news story. And it set off a firestorm. 3 so-called reporters were on the byline of this story. So 3 reporters at the New York Times contributed to this story, this now debunked story. One of which was this woman, a woman by the name of Anat Schwartz. There she is. Keep her up on the screen, if you will. She's playing with her hair. She's teasing her hair. You can see she was born in Israel and served in the IDF intelligence service for the Israeli Air Force. We know this thanks to amazing reporting over the past few hours from Zay Squirrel on X. Even friend of the show Glenn Greenwald had this to say about Squirrel. One of the most significant journalistic scandals at the New York Times in the last couple of years was broken by Zay Squirrel. Yeah, in the past 24 hours. We already knew the article had been debunked, but thanks to this guy, Squirrel, we now know her IDF connections and her social media posts about annihilating Palestinians. More on that part of the story in a second, so she liked to talk about that on social media. What else do we know about her, though? Well, we know she's never once in her... Listen to this. She's never once in her life published another news article.
Wait, what?
She's never... I'll repeat it for those paying attention. She's never once in her life published another news article. Meaning she's never written a single piece of journalism, published journalism, ever. But she somehow got to publish a front page story at the New York Times. How exactly does that happen? But it gets worse, because Zay Squirrel found out Schwartz was simultaneously still working for Israel's state-run media while also working at the New York Times.
Okay, so all of this benefit of the doubt I'm giving her is dying on the vine right now, right before our very eyes.
And how do we know that? We know this because it's on her frickin' Wikipedia or his LinkedIn page. So she's working for Israeli public broadcasting at the same time that she's working at the New York Times. But even beyond working for Israeli intelligence is the fact that she has a history of liking social media posts that call for the total annihilation of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. So maybe she could have disclosed that in her article, like, hey, I'm the reporter on this story. Hey, by the way, I would love to see Palestinians annihilated. She could have put that in the story. Maybe we wouldn't have thought she's an actual reporter. We would have gotten accurate information. She liked this tweet, for instance. Here's a tweet she liked on October 7th, where this guy says, quote, you can see that Anat liked this tweet. She says, he says, turn the Strip into a slaughterhouse. If a hair falls from their head, execute security prisoners. Violate any norm on the way to victory for them to see and be seen. So she liked that tweet, annihilate them. So this New York Times article, and here's again the front page to remind you of this, screams without words how Hamas weaponized sexual violence on October 7th. Look at this family, right? This family, of course, the way the New York Times paints it is they're in ruins, of course, and they're detailing here the sexual violence against this family's daughter and their history of sexual violence and the killing of babies to terrorize the Israelis on October 7th. The article, of course, has been totally debunked by the great reporting at the Gray Zone, who first debunked this. They were the first to debunk it, and then others came along and also debunked it. Other news organizations have now done the same about this original New York Times fake story. So even the Israeli family featured in this New York Times article refuted the story. The family whose photo you saw there. No, our daughter wasn't raped. We can't believe the New York Times actually said that, the family said. So the Israeli family featured in that photo of this article said the New York Times manipulated them. The family told Israeli newspapers that the New York Times fabricated the rape part of the story. There's no evidence our daughter was raped. Whoops.
I just came today from Palestine, carrying in my heart and in my mind the story of Gaza and the suffering of the people, the story of Palestine, about which Nelson Mandela said before anybody else that it is the most important moral issue of our time. Palestine is suffering today from the most terrible atrocity. 3 war crimes are taking place at the same time in parallel. The war crime of genocide, the war crime of ethnic cleansing, the war crime of collective punishment. And the results are shocking. 37,000 people killed so far, including those who are under the rubble that nobody can get to. 73,000 injured people. 700,000 people at this time are suffering from starvation in the north of Gaza. 1 million people are now sick of different diseases because of the siege, lack of water, lack of food. Israel is killing us with bombardment, with starvation, and also with diseases. They have thrown on us American bombs, the largest air bridge ever organized in the Middle East for Israel by the United States of America. 70,000 tons of explosives thrown on that little place that is Gaza, which is not larger than 140 square miles. 70,000 tons of explosives. That is more than double both nuclear bombs thrown on Nagasaki and Hiroshima during the Second World War. It is 30 kilograms of explosives for each man, woman, and child in Gaza. Today is the International Women's Day, and I congratulate all women here on this day. But on this day, 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza cannot find a safe place to give birth in. 64,000 breastfeeding women cannot feed their babies because they are hungry. They don't have food. 350,000 girls and women are starving now in the north of Gaza because of this terrible Israeli crime. My heart, I told my colleagues today, my heart broke when I watched a little child in Gaza who is one of 1,000 children who lost their limbs up till now, asking his father, the 5-year-old baby asks his father, he lost both hands, and he was asking his father, will my hands grow up again when I grow up? That is the suffering of thousands of children, 17,000 orphans up till now in Gaza because of this terrible Israeli crime. 7th of October was not the beginning of history. We have been suffering from ethnic cleansing since 76 years, since 1948, when Israel committed the first Nakba, and it is now committing the second Nakba. 57 years of military Israeli occupation, the longest in modern history, and the worst system of apartheid. I used to say apartheid in Palestine was like apartheid in South Africa, but you, the South African friends and comrades, told me when you came to Palestine, no, this is a much worse apartheid than what prevailed in South Africa. That is the reality of today. And we all remember, Israelis don't understand why South Africa is with us. They forgot that when they were supporting the apartheid system here, doing nuclear experiments with the apartheid regime here, when the prime minister of the apartheid system said in 1963, Israel is like South Africa, is also an apartheid state. They forgot that. They forgot that while they were supporting apartheid here in South Africa, our revolutionaries in the Palestinian Revolution were supporting the fighters of the ANC for the freedom of South Africa.
Van más de 30.000 muertos por bombardeo, por fuego de fusil, 15.000 niños y niñas. Eran combatientes guerrilleros de Hamas, esos 30.000 asesinados. Eran combatientes guerrilleros de Hamas, los 107 mujeres, niños y hombres asesinados cerca de Rafah, con el único delito de ir a recibir comida que lleva Naciones Unidas. Recientemente vimos un hecho que comentaba en la reunión. Un soldado de la Fuerza Aérea de los Estados Unidos que no aguantó el dolor, la indignación y llegó a una situación extrema y se inmoló, se prendió fuego en las puertas de la Embajada de Israel en Washington. Eso desencadenó en un conjunto de protestas de militares y militares estadounidenses quemando su uniforme y levantando su voz. Yo diría, si un hombre es capaz de inmolarse, no somos capaces de levantar una voz unida de América Latina y el Caribe por la vida, por el derecho internacional, por los derechos humanos. ¿Dónde está la Corte Internacional de Justicia? ¿Dónde están los organismos de la justicia internacional? ¿O es que no ven? ¿O es que no oyen? Creo que es válida la preocupación de millones de seres humanos sobre el planeta y de decenas de gobiernos para que nuestra región tenga una posición clara y acompañe a la Unión Africana, a la Liga Árabe, a la Organización de la Comunidad Islámica y a los pueblos del mundo buscando y exigiendo el cese al fuego ya en Gaza, el respeto a la vida de los palestinos y que se investigue y se juzgue de acuerdo a la justicia internacional al señor Netanyahu y al gobierno fascista, neonazi de Israel.
Klar, Israel hat jedes Recht, sich gegen den terroristischen Angriff der Hamas zu verteidigen. Deutschland hat eine besondere und eine gute Beziehung zu Israel. Wir haben eine klare Position über das, was jetzt notwendig ist. Dazu zählt die Freilassung der Geiseln, dazu zählt humanitäre Hilfe, dazu gehört die Perspektive einer Zwei-Staaten-Lösung und die Staatsgründung Israels sehr unterstützt.
You cannot find a solution by getting so one-sided in terms of looking only at one particular issue and erase 60 years of atrocities. The solution is not just releasing the hostages. What about the settlements? What about the behavior of the settlers now? Continues daily. What about the dispossession, their land, their rights, their dignity, their men, their women, their children? Are these of no concern? Where have we thrown our humanity? Why this hypocrisy? Why this selective and ambivalent attitude towards one race and one another? Is it because they are colored or they are different religion? But I, of course, cannot accept the fact that when you discuss issues, we only confine to one particular incident and one victim, forgetting the thousands and thousands of victims from the Nakba of 1947, 1948.
Of Shin Bet, could you describe what is the reality for Palestinians here?
A life of people who dream about freedom and don't see it. Whether we like it or not, we control the life of millions.
If you were a Palestinian living in the West Bank or Gaza, what would your view be of Israel?
I would fight against Israel in order to achieve my liberty.
How would you fight? How dirty?
I would do everything in order to achieve my liberty, and that's it.
How powerful are Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and what do you think of them?
I see them as terrorists and as Jewish messianics. They represent only a small minority within the Israeli society, but they get their power because of our coalition system.
But can I just check something? Are you calling the Minister for National Security and the Minister for Finance in Israel, are you calling them terrorists?
Of course. They are.
Saying Benjamin Netanyahu deliberately boosted Hamas to try to prevent a Palestinian state.
Yeah, sure. He deliberately and systematically even told, is on record, whoever wants to avoid the threat of a two-state solution has to support my policy of paying protection money to the Hamas.
So what we did, with the permission of our Prime Minister, is to let Qatar to transfer a huge amount of money in cash, probably more than $1.4 billion. By doing it, we increased the power of Hamas. We did everything in order to make sure that Hamas will go on controlling Gaza, and Palestinian Authority will control the West Bank, so they will fight each other.
Netanyahu maintains the Qatar money was to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe. Having helped to build up Hamas, Netanyahu has now vowed to destroy it.
He fed the beast, and it exploded in our face. If you base your national security strategy solely on force, then you need to win 24/7 forever.
So I have very little sympathy for what has become of that state. It's a satanic state. You know, you look at the polls, 60% of Israelis, 60%, say Israel's not using enough force in Gaza. It's not using enough force in Gaza. If you look at every metric out there, every metric, intensity of bombing, payload of bombs, imprecision of bombs, destruction of civilian infrastructure, ratio of civilians to combatants killed, ratio of children to total numbers killed, ratio of women and children to total numbers killed. If you look at every metric, there have been so many studies now done. What Israel is doing in Gaza is in a class completely its own. You know, it doesn't even compare. It doesn't even compare remotely to the carpet bombing of German cities during World War II, the Allied carpet bombing of German cities, the Allied bombing of Dresden. Doesn't compare.
I mean, the basic argument for supporting Israel has been, first, we share values. Well, Israel is demonstrating the values of the Ku Klux Klan, and I don't share those values. And second, I mean, basically what's going on in Gaza is a mass lynching. It's totally extrajudicial, illegal, and brutal, and utterly inhumane. And the second reason is supposedly that Israel is a strategic asset. But I have never heard anyone describe what it does for us other than get us in trouble. So I think this is a moment in which the Israelis have made a huge mistake because, you know, the question they used to pose was, does Israel have a right to exist? Which is a rather strange question because it does exist. I don't know of other countries that run around asking whether they have a right to exist. But I think that question is being replaced now in much of the world by, does Israel deserve to exist? Can the world really maintain normal relations with a country that behaves in utter disregard of international law and in...
Israel is targeting
everybody in Gaza. Nobody is safe. This is real-life Hunger Games. This is a real-life Squid Game. This is a real-life Black Mirror episode. But unfortunately, it's people's lives that are at stake. It's not just a TV show. It's not just a movie. You can't turn it off. It's not a fiction. It's real life. The ratio of killing in Gaza of civilians is significantly higher than the average civilian toll in all conflicts around the world during the 20th century. So what we're seeing in Gaza is unprecedented killing at unprecedented rates, using unprecedented technology. We know that Israel is relying on AI technology to identify more targets than they've ever been able to identify in a shorter amount of time, which is what explains the scope of the destruction and devastation and the killing that we have seen in Gaza. An investigation was published by 972 magazine entitled "A Mass Assassination Factory." And that investigation relied on the testimonies of current and former Israeli intelligence officials who were quoted as confirming that Israel intentionally targets Palestinian family homes and apartment buildings in its airstrikes, and that this is not an accident. Our families are not collateral damage, rather they are the targets of Israel's attack on purpose. Israel refers to those targets as power targets. And this is an intentional policy that is designed to create as much carnage as possible, to create as much despair and devastation as possible. In the words of the Israeli intelligence officers describing this practice, it's intended to put pressure on Hamas by putting pressure on the entire civilian population. This practice meets the definition of terrorism. Terrorism is specifically unlawful targeting of civilians using violence for a political purpose. But of course, this is never dealt with in the mainstream media. It's also never dealt with by the government officials who are arming and financing this genocide. So a few days after the Mass Assassination Factory investigation was published, Matthew Miller of the US State Department was questioned whether he believed Israel was intentionally targeting civilians. And he replied, "I have not seen any evidence that Israel is intentionally targeting civilians." Now, am I to believe that I have more information about what Israel is doing in Gaza than the US State Department? That's an insane premise, because this was a public report which was published just days prior. And yet the US lives in this fictional reality which it has created, which enables it to ignore clear evidence, videos, photos, testimonies coming out from on the ground by Palestinians who are living this genocide. Part of Israel's dystopian reality is the way that it uses technology to oppress Palestinians and to carry out this genocide. So we've seen Israel use drones to send threatening messages to Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. We've seen them use other types of drones that have a very disruptive and disturbing buzzing sound, and those drones fly over Gaza at all times to make Palestinians think that an airstrike is impending, but in reality it's just the sound of the drone, which is entire purpose is to fill the sky with buzzing sounds and to create fear in the Palestinian society. We've also seen Israel employ tactics whereby it drops leaflets telling Palestinians that they must evacuate, but evacuate to where, it's unclear, because we know that everywhere Israel has told Palestinians to evacuate has also been bombed and not spared from the brutality of Israeli airstrikes. We've seen Israel rely on QR technology, telling Palestinians that their neighborhoods have now been divided into numbered orders and that it will announce which numbers are going to be airstriked and that Palestinians should evacuate from one numbered area to another numbered area. But it does so at a time when they're also cutting communications so that Palestinians can't even access this very twisted technology. But even if they do, again, they're not spared and they are targeted. So it's really just to create this impression that Israel is providing a safe outlet for Palestinians, but the reality is that nowhere is safe, and that everywhere that Israel has told Palestinians to go during this genocide has not been spared and has been subject to airstrike. The weapons that are being used in Gaza are the most advanced weapons in existence, and in many cases they're being tested on Gaza's civilian population, being used for the very first time. And we know also that once those weapons have been tested on Gazan civilians, they then can be sold to governments around the world with the label battle tested, and that also increases their value. All of this is, of course, dystopian. There's no other word for it, especially when you remember that 1 million children live in Gaza, that they are half of the population, and that while they are being bombarded with the most advanced weapons known to man, they are also being starved and dehydrated and succumbing to disease all at the same time. I don't think there's any way for us to really understand the totality of the scope of the human suffering in Gaza right now. Every form of human suffering that could possibly exist exists right now in Gaza. All of it. Starvation, dehydration, the sounds of the bombs, the sounds of the drones. You've never had a day of quiet. The smells, everything smells like death. Everything smells like burning, toxic gas. There's no fresh air, there's no clean air. Everything smells like rotting flesh and blood. The sights, everywhere you go, there's destruction. Everywhere you go, concrete and iron and blood and destroyed buildings and destroyed homes and destroyed businesses. The way that people must live in their bodies in this moment. Pure anxiety, depression, shock, PTSD that never ends. The feeling, if you're injured in these airstrikes, the amount of pain, the agony, the inability to find any relief. There's no medicine, there's no anesthesia. We heard reports of pregnant women being forced to give birth via cesarean section with no anesthesia. My brother-in-law's cousin recently gave birth, and he described her birth scene as her giving birth on the floor of a UN school where there was no electricity and there was only a flashlight and an iPhone light to guide the individuals helping her. When you think about all of it, you realize that there isn't an ounce of relief anywhere in Gaza, and that everybody's senses are being bombarded with different forms of torture at all times.
מה זו התפיסה הזאת של יהודי מפוחד וגלותי? אנחנו צריכים לבקש רשות מהעולם! אנחנו צריכים לבקש רשות מהעולם! אהלן וסהלן יא עזה, התחלנו לדבר ערבית, הייתה אמורה להיות תוכנית עבודה של מדינת ישראל! היהודי החדש הזה שאנחנו מדברים עליו זה יהודי שעומד קרוב מול האויב שלו. הוא מסתכל לו בלבן של העיניים שנייה לפני שהוא מוריד לו את הראש. מול הבעיה העזתית יש רק משוואה אחת. כוח יענה בהרבה יותר כוח. תזכרו שהסכמים עושים אך
After all these months of horrors, things that once shocked and ignited global debates now pass with barely a word. Attacks on hospitals, once covered in Israeli justifications for what is almost always a war crime, were fiercely contested. Now, scores of hospitals have been attacked. The media doesn't even keep track anymore. As Israeli atrocities have become impossible to defend, the easier path for liberal Zionists has been to simply turn away, plug their eyes and their ears, harden their hearts to the horror. Even for those of us who can't or won't look away, how can any person truly fully grasp the absolute heartbreak and agony represented by images such as this? Now, this map is the result of a Guardian investigation showing the sheer level of complete destruction of the Gaza Strip. The red areas you see there that dominate the map, vividly illustrating the impact of a bombing campaign that even Joe Biden has described as indiscriminate. Each red pixel representing a house where a family gathered to celebrate a birth or a death, or just the normal, beautiful humdrum of life. A school where children's dreams were nurtured. A hospital where countless newborns took their first breaths in the loving arms of their parents. And now it's all painted in red and reduced to rubble. Somewhere under these red pixels are also the solemn places where Palestinians said goodbye to their loved ones, buried them according to sacred traditions, laid them to rest with what they hoped would be eternal dignity. Even these graveyards, places of mourning, symbolizing the link across generations, even these were destroyed by the Israeli military.
Today, the Israeli military acknowledged that they rolled into a cemetery, took bodies out of graves as part of what they say is a search for Israeli hostages' remains. But as the Israeli military put out that statement, we were completing our investigation into the Israeli military's desecration of cemeteries. And what we found is 16 cemeteries across Gaza damaged or destroyed. I do want to warn our viewers that they may find some of these images disturbing.
In Gaza, even the dead cannot escape the indignities of war. More than a dozen cemeteries like this one in Jabalia, desecrated by the Israeli military. Gravestones destroyed, soil upturned, tread marks leaving little left for the living to honor their dead. This is that same graveyard before the war. 1 month later, a series of tread marks can be seen on the northwestern edge. It is no exception. A CNN analysis of videos and satellite imagery found that 16 cemeteries have been damaged or destroyed by the Israeli military since it launched its ground offensive.
So 16 cemeteries, as I said there, were identified by CNN as having been desecrated in every way imaginable, and some truly beyond the imagination. Bodies exhumed, tombs destroyed, military outposts established on top of grave sites. Now, it would be easy to overlook the destruction of these places and violation of these bodies. After all, they're already dead, and the scale of suffering of the living understandably takes precedence. But in the desecration of cemeteries, we catch a glimpse of the true goals of this operation, and it has nothing to do with hunting Hamas or with destroying Hamas tunnels. In truth, Israel seeks the total annihilation of Palestinian life. In fact, 80% of the tunnel system remains intact. And while some Hamas fighters, yes, have been killed, the commitment to violent resistance that's the lifeblood of Hamas has probably never been stronger. In practical terms, of organization and power as well, Hamas is apparently regrouping and retaking civilian control of northern Gaza as the IDF has moved south. In fact, Israel's shifting justifications for desecrating the cemeteries are so thin that even CNN is calling bullshit. So in that initial report that I just showed, the IDF claimed, you heard Jeremy Diamond say there, that they razed the cemeteries to search for hostage remains. In a follow-up investigation, though, the Israelis changed their story, attempting to claim that they had no choice but to destroy at least one cemetery because of Hamas tunnels located underneath of it. Having already seen too much, however, CNN reporter Jeremy Diamond does not buy it.
Back with our world lead now, a week after a CNN investigation into the Israeli military's destruction of cemeteries in Gaza, the IDF invited CNN's Jeremy Diamond to what they say was a Hamas tunnel underneath a Gaza cemetery. Then they refused to show him exactly where the tunnel entrance was in the crater that was once a graveyard.
This is no ordinary quarry. It's where the living once buried their dead. Gaza's Bani Sahela cemetery, hollowed out by Israeli excavators.
These were all graves. This was a cemetery, but the military says that they were forced to come in here because they discovered a Hamas tunnel running right underneath that cemetery.
But the Israeli military failed to prove that stunning claim during a 3-hour tour of the area.
So in the segment, they go on to show an Israeli general leading Jeremy Diamond through a tunnel network, including a so-called command center that he claims, the general claims, runs underneath of the cemetery. But the entrance that Diamond is led into and out of is not really close to the cemetery. And when Diamond presses for visual confirmation of the tunnel system actually being below the cemetery, the general gets really squirrely and is ultimately caught in a complete lie.
We're asking the general if we can actually see the shaft to the tunnel.
But the answer is no.
So?
There's all kinds of machinery which I don't want you to take pictures of. The security might force it.
What about if we don't film it? We just look with our eyes.
And then you might fall in, the whole thing can collapse. Or you have to walk to the edge is not secured, it can collapse, there's machinery, so on. It's not something I'm going to take a risk on. Sorry.
The Israeli military later provided this drone footage, showing the tunnel shaft we entered and another one nearby. CNN geolocated the footage using this satellite image. This outline shows where the cemetery once stood, and these are the two tunnel entrances clearly outside the graveyard. As for the tunnel they say they found here, where the cemetery once stood, the military never provided any evidence.
And Jake, we pressed the Israeli military multiple times for that evidence, but instead they released a press release today that actually poked more holes in their story. The story that General Goldfuss told us when we were in that underground command center. He said that we were just below the cemetery, but the press release, a map that the Israeli military released today, actually places that command center well outside the bounds of that cemetery. More questions than answers.
Actually, I think you pretty clearly got your answer. And if you need more answers, I would recommend you listen to the detailed plans and grand visions which were laid out at the massive conference that a dozen ministers from Netanyahu's government just attended. Here, they don't hide behind lies about tunnels, hunting Hamas, or human shields. The goal of annihilation is out in the open. And that goal is entirely consistent with the military operation that we have witnessed, the imposed starvation, and the new attacks on vital aid agencies. According to Haaretz, the crowd at this resettlement conference was most rapturous when hearing calls for genocide and ethnic cleansing. Quote, the biggest response came for videos of soldiers in Gaza calling for the Strip to be resettled, shouting out that there are no innocents, or photographing themselves with banners for the Katif bloc, that's the former Gaza settlements. The crowd responded to these with deafening cries and whistles. An attorney who was there distributed pamphlets positing a legal rationale for what he openly called Nakba 2.0. A rabbi claimed the only righteous course of action was to conquer the territory and, quote, the destruction and expulsion of anyone who opposes the rule of the Jewish people. Now, this genocidal philosophy explains the rationale behind the utter destruction of civilian life in Gaza far better than any preposterous hunt for Hamas narrative. The attack on UNRWA, the UN agency devoted to Palestinian aid, also fits perfectly with this actual objective. It serves two purposes in the goal of annihilation. The first is quite obvious. At a time when Palestinians in Gaza are eating grass and drinking polluted water and literally starving to death, defunding UNRWA means more suffering, more death, more pressure on the population to flee out of the Strip entirely, never to return, just as those conference attendees are very clear that they ultimately want. As Bibi's communications minister put it at the ethnic cleansing conference, quote, voluntary emigration is at times a situation you impose until they give their consent. But it is also an assault on the very idea of Palestinians as a people with any right to self-determination. Because UNRWA's mission is to serve Palestinian refugees, which necessarily means that Palestinians are a people, that they deserve a state, and that they will remain refugees with a right of return until such time as a just land settlement occurs. For the Israelis, this is unacceptable. Palestinians, their families, their aspirations, their places of worship and education and daily life, and even cemeteries should be crushed into oblivion until, as a people, they just simply give up. All the IDF lies are really in service of hiding this true goal. And even the dead aren't left in peace. What chance do the living stand?
So let's get to the next graphic. AIPAC dedicates an entire section of its file for members to rebuke the president's comments under the subhead, why is President Biden dictating to Israel how to fight this war while simultaneously demanding military assistance from his government? Let me just pause right there. If Israel wants to carry out war crimes, they shouldn't do it with our money. You can't, on one hand, demand that American taxpayers who are desperate for a better life here in America, they need to hand over billions of dollars to the Israeli government and the IDF, and we need to shut the F up about any of our critique. AIPAC is evil. AIPAC is evil, evil. My fellow Americans, are you okay with that? Are you okay with a lobbying group representing the best interests of a foreign government telling you you need to bust your ass every day, work a job that you likely hate, and have a portion of your earnings taken from you by our federal government and funneled to the Israeli government so they can commit atrocities in the Gaza Strip? Are you okay with that? Because I'm not okay with that. And nothing gets under my skin more, okay, than hearing these pieces of crap say things that make it clear that they feel entitled to our money. Entitled. That
American-Israel Public Affairs Committee. It was incorporated in 1963. For 10 years prior to that, it was known as the American Zionist Committee for Public Affairs. AIPAC calls itself America's pro-Israel lobby, and according to its website, it has over 3 million members across the country in regional chapters working to, quote, expand and strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship, end quote. You may know AIPAC as being one of the biggest and most recognizable donors to many of the members of Congress in your state. But contributing to campaigns is a relatively new function of the organization. Before 2021, AIPAC did not endorse candidates nor give political contributions. Its focus was on lobbying elected officials, not actually electing officials. But in a dramatic shift in policy, AIPAC began directly funding candidates and spending big on races in 2021. AIPAC Political Action Committee, AIPAC-PAC, filed something called a Statement of Organization with the FEC just in time for the 2022 election cycle, where it spent $50 million, including both direct contributions to candidates and outside spending like TV advertisements. According to AIPAC, it donated money to 365 candidates from both parties, including every single member of both Democratic and Republican leadership in Congress. 109 Republicans who voted against the certification of the 2020 presidential election in America received campaign contributions from AIPAC. All in all, AIPAC gave money to 342 members of the 118th Congress. The 2022 elections were the most expensive midterms in American history, with a total cost of $8.9 billion spent. Now, last year, AIPAC ranked 15th in total expenditure by a political action committee, according to data collected by Open Secrets. But take a look at the other funders that AIPAC is competing against for that title. Act Blue and Win Red. They are Democratic and Republican Party machines. Save America is Donald Trump's money-raising operation. The Conservative Club for Growth, Emily's List, focuses on electing Democratic women to office. All of the PACs on this list are massively domestic-focused ideological machines. AIPAC is the only organization in the top 20 whose interests are focused entirely on America's relationship to a foreign government. Now, let's take a look at who benefits from AIPAC's largesse. Here are the top 20 recipients in Congress, the House and the Senate, of AIPAC money in the 2022 midterm cycle, according to Open Secrets. They're members of both parties. They come from every corner of the country with varying levels of experience in Congress. The Democrat Glenn Ivey of Maryland tops the list. He beat out fellow Democrat Donna Edwards in Maryland's House primary after AIPAC poured millions into pro-Ivey advertisements and mailers. Edwards was running for a second stint in Congress after serving during the Obama administration, where she voted present, not even a no, on a number of pro-Israel resolutions. So the money poured in against her. Not even an endorsement from Nancy Pelosi could save her. Michigan Democrat Haley Stevens unseated Democratic Representative Andy Levin. Here's what Levin had to say about that.
I'm really Jewish, but AIPAC can't stand the idea that I am the clearest, strongest Jewish voice in Congress, standing for a simple proposition that there's no way to have a secure democratic homeland for the Jewish people unless we achieve the political and human rights of the Palestinian people.
AIPAC spent $4 million against Levin. He lost by 20 points. When Michigan Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian American in Congress, was censured by the House in early November over what some lawmakers called her rhetoric around the Israeli-Hamas war, 22 Democrats joined Republicans in that censure vote. 18 of those Democrats received campaign funds from AIPAC in 2022, totaling more than $1.1 million. By the way, for these 6 of them, AIPAC was their top contributor. A growing list of progressive lawmakers who are vocal in their criticism of the government of Israel and its policies and their support for Palestinian self-determination have inspired AIPAC to spend even more. As progressive lawmakers began calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, Slate reported that insiders expect AIPAC's 2024 spending to hit $100 million. In fact, United Democracy Project, which is a pro-Israel super PAC affiliated with AIPAC, is already spending money on attack ads against Democratic Representatives Jamal Bowman of New York and Summer Lee of Pennsylvania. Lee has already got a primary challenger, as do Cori Bush and Ilhan Omar. Pro-Israel donors have already signaled that they're eager to primary Rashida Tlaib and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Congresswoman Lee already overcame AIPAC's financial influence against her once. She tweeted criticisms of Israel's treatment of Palestinians in 2021, but as a candidate, she affirmed Israel's right to exist. But that's not good enough. AIPAC spent nearly $3 million in the primary alone to defeat Lee, and they almost did. She beat Stephen Irwin, who is third on the list of money given to candidates by AIPAC in 2022, by less than 1,000 votes. And if Congresswoman Lee wants to keep her seat in 2024, she's going to have to do it all over again. She joins me in studio after this break.
I've got an itch I can't scratch, I'm missing a piece that completes a whole part of me, an open wound scar to see. Everybody come here, gather round, welcome to the freak show, the best in town. What the hell's wrong with me? I don't get along with anybody, honestly. I've been living in my own head constantly, thoughts jumbled around, think I need a new lobotomy. Wait, all these thoughts are too negative. I don't wanna get lost in the sedative. Gotta show them what I got, I'm competitive. You know I'm about to go off, I won't let them win, I'll take a stab. I wanna chase a bag, I wanna weigh, I can change all the things I lack. I gotta face the facts, I got a taste in that. Got me obsessed with the rest, I got an itch to scratch. I'll give up everything. The venom in my brain, running from the past, wanna escape my pain. I just wanna be a better person, I deserve this, I just wanna break these chains. Always asking for greatness, true to myself, I never fake it. Seen too many once that I so they get famous. And when I say the truth, most really can't take it. In spite of everything I've been through, I'ma make it. Fake friends, but on my downfall is toxic. Day one, started the outlaws for profit. Now all I do is write verses, no talking. All I do is put the work in, no option. This was everything I ever wanted, created a legacy off of me just being honest. And the fake ones hate, but it's all to no avail. They wanna see me lose, but you know I never fail. I'll give up everything, daunting if I can see my dream. Cause I'll do anything. Want a reality.